Hello, thank you very much for inviting me to come. I'm very pleased to be here, even though it is 35 degrees in Australia at the moment. I had completely misread the program and prepared far too much, so I'm going to try and skim over some of the slides, but there's much more detail in the slides that you've got in the pack, and there's a whole list of references in case anybody's interested in following those things up. I've been doing research about people who are ageing with intellectual disability for the last 25 years, and now I'm actually an older person too, so it gives you a new perspective on the world. But mainly my research has been in Australia, but I've done some comparative work. Mainly it's been small scale, but I've seen a series of repeated patterns in the literature over this time. The perspective that I take is a life course perspective, that ageing is a lifelong process. It's influenced by a person's individual biography, by their social context, and the historic time in which they live and age. And that social relationships and community connections are really fundamental to good health. If you don't have those things, then the chances of having good health as you age are fairly remote. So what I want to do today is to try and review some of the knowledge that we know about ageing and good support. And then, having done that fairly quickly, look at some of the continuity of the data across the different cohorts of people with intellectual disabilities who are ageing, and reflect on the new cohort of people that are now middle-aged, that are going to be older in a few years. And really ask the sort of rhetorical question, are the baby boomers, which is my generation, who, without intellectual disabilities, are rewriting the ageing script about ageing in terms of choice, freedom and lifestyle, is this the same thing that's happening for people with intellectual disabilities or not, which I want to propose that they're not. And then to ask the question, why is it so hard? Why have we come such a little way in relation to the lives of people with intellectual disabilities who are ageing? It should come as no surprise to most of you in the room, I think, that people with intellectual disabilities who are older have a much higher risk of a poor quality of life than other older people in the community, and of younger people with intellectual disabilities. So on all of these quality of life domains, people with intellectual disabilities who are older fare really badly. They're at risk in terms of their physical well-being, their emotional well-being, their interpersonal relationships, their material well-being, their personal development, their self-determination, their social inclusion, and their rights. So they do not fare very well at all as they enter into old age. But at the same time, later life for many older people is also a time of enormous opportunity. There's some evidence that suggests that post-parents, in that phase when your parents have passed away or when people have moved away from their parents in mid and later life, that is a time of opportunity and growth for adults with an intellectual disability. This quote comes from two people that were in a study that I conducted, which was my PhD back in 1996. These two people with intellectual disabilities had lived at home with their families until they were in their mid-40s. When their parents died, Rod advertised for a wife and he found Isabel, and they were married when they were in their 50s. And they lived together independently in the community for about 24 years after that, supported by the local people in their church community. And a family friend who'd managed Rob's affairs since his parents had died said, well, of course his parents never expected Rod to marry. That was the last thing in the world they ever imagined. And recent work that we've been doing in Australia shows that middle-aged people and older people who have now been able to move out of home and are in supported living situations really rejoice in the freedom of being away from their parents, of not being told what to do, and having much greater freedom of choice. But many of these people are also lonely. So there's some very important reminders, I think, in thinking about later life, that there are dangers of planning for people's old age much too closely without listening to the people's voices as well about what they might want to do in old age. And that moving away from parents and getting older may not necessarily be problematic if you have somewhere to live and if you have good social support. The fact that people with intellectual disabilities have an increased lifespan is no longer news. We talked about this 30 years ago, that people were now beginning to live into their 70s. And at that time, there was an optimism that we would close the gap and that people with intellectual disabilities would begin to have a much more of a normal lifespan. At that time, they had a different life expectancy still from the mainstream population, and people with more severe and profound disabilities still had a shortened lifespan. But we weren't too worried by those differences because we thought they were due to genetics, to secondary health conditions, and to people's medical fragility. But over that last 30 years, the life expectancy gap hasn't closed. It's actually stayed quite the same. So in the UK, some recent figures from Pauline Heslop and her group suggest that the average life expectancy for somebody with an intellectual disability from birth is 64 years, and it's still only 68 for somebody with a mild intellectual disability, compared to 80 for the general population. And her data suggests that the mortality rate of people with intellectual disability is twice that of the general population, and that they have significantly poorer health across the entire life course that extends into old age. But what we do know is that the impact of the social on life expectancy and health is much more powerful than we thought. Knowledge has increased about the underlying reasons for the life expectancy gap and the poorer health status. It's not inevitable that people with intellectual disabilities will have poor health as they age. It's not inevitable that they'll die earlier. For example, Pauline Heslop and her group found that 37% of deaths of people with intellectual disability were avoidable deaths, were amenable to good quality healthcare, compared to 13% of the general population. We know now that many of the differences in the health of people with intellectual disabilities and their mortality stem from what we call health disparities, stem from their membership of the group of people being a person with intellectual disability, and the social and economic disadvantage and the system disadvantages that are associated with membership of that group. They have poorer health and they live for less time because they have an unresponsive healthcare system that doesn't listen to the needs of themselves, doesn't listen to them or to the voices of their carers, that doesn't recognise and adjust to their needs, and that needs health advocates, and people with intellectual disabilities don't have strong health advocates in the system. We also know too that people with intellectual disabilities have very unhealthy lifestyles. They have low exercise rates, poor diet, low use of preventive health care, regular checks, low screening, low levels of social support. All of those things cause their health to be much worse than everybody else's, and all of those things are avoidable. I'm not going to talk much about these. There's two programs of research that really stand out in relation to people with intellectual disabilities and ageing. And Elise is going to talk about the work of her and Mary McCarran and her colleagues in Ireland. What they've done is a longitudinal study of people who are ageing in Ireland, and they've compared the health of people with intellectual disabilities to the health of the mainstream population, which really starkly shows you the differences and where some of the interventions need to be. Helena Evan-Hewis and her colleagues have done a lot of work in the Netherlands, particularly around the patterns of ageing and the vulnerability of people with intellectual disability as they age. We used to think that people with intellectual disabilities all aged prematurely and aged in a different way. What they've managed to show is that even though people with intellectual disabilities exhibit frailty at a much earlier age, that frailty isn't necessarily associated with the ageing process. It's associated with potential preventable and reversible factors, like low levels of physical activity, poor social relationships, and low levels of community participation. Those are important things for thinking about how we might intervene and improve the ageing process. Dementia too, it's very clear that there's a very high risk of dementia, particularly for people with Down syndrome as they age. And there's been significant work over the last 10, 15 years on the course of dementia for people with intellectual disabilities, on better tools for diagnosis, on models of support and practice guidelines, on making services, mainstream services accessible and adapting them to people with intellectual disabilities. There's even begun to be some really good work about looking at interventions, and do the interventions for people with mainstream dementia work for people with intellectual disabilities. And remarkably, in Ireland, over half of the people with Down syndrome are now screened in mainstream memory clinics, and those numbers are rising. But the story is very different in Australia and I think in most parts of the UK, where staff in intellectual disability group homes have really little idea about adapting to support people with dementia. And there's very serendipitous and chaotic pathways to diagnosis. Even though we know much more about diagnosis, actually getting a diagnosis and then being supported through that diagnosis is incredibly difficult. We know a lot more now about adjusting healthcare systems. There's a lot of knowledge about how to adapt systems. We've made some progress around implementing health checks, embedding them in health service systems. In Australia, around providing more time and money for doctors to treat people with intellectual disabilities. And the work that's been done in the UK and in Canada has been very helpful in terms of showing the sort of systematic adjustments that are needed to primary care and hospital systems. But what we've done is we've struggled, both in Australia and in the UK, we've struggled to implement those changes and to embed them within mainstream systems. People with intellectual disabilities have become one of the many minority groups competing for attention and squeezing into medical training. In Australia, and I think it's probably the same here to a great extent, there's no routine identification of people with intellectual disabilities as they enter a hospital system or aged care services. And so there's no good data to inform change and advocacy. And we know data on health inequalities is very powerful. It's been very powerful in our Indigenous community in Australia. And there's a lot of unresolved dilemmas too, particularly in relation to people who are ageing, about where should we have specialist services? Where should the knowledge about ageing and intellectual disability and ageing and dementia and intellectual disability lie to make it more effective? And what is the role of that specialist knowledge? We really know very little about that. In terms of planning for the future and mutual caring, what happens when I die is one of those questions that is most often associated with ageing of people with intellectual disability. There was a book written with that title way back in the 1960s. And we've tended to saturate issues of later life with the problems from parental perspectives, their worry about what happens when they're no longer there. There's been a lot of research on planning and support, and it's been renamed now mutual caring, people staying at home, people caring for their elderly parents and their elderly parents caring for them. And that research has been driven obviously by the increased life expectancy, by the number of people who are now outliving their parents, but also by the policy shifts around carers in the 1990s. But what there is there's very little research on the efficacy of those interventions and how useful they are. Hella did a study just very recently which was trying to look at the family support interventions and how successful they were for people with intellectual disabilities. Remarkably, in a 20-year period, she found only 14 studies that were looking at interventions in families of adults with intellectual disabilities. This compares to 55 studies in a 4-year period in the mainstream population. So you can see how under-researched the efficacy of family interventions is in our field. What she found was there were 3 main types of interventions: care coordination and case management, where families are linked to services and supported to plan; in-home support and financial support to continue to care; and then a whole range of different types of psychosocial education and training programs. What she found was that most of these programs were effective, that they support both parents and people with intellectual disabilities to think about the future. They increase the choice of the person with intellectual disability, they provide them with greater knowledge and confidence to plan for the future and in coping and thinking about the future. We also know from some of the work that I've done and some of the early research on planning that effective plans are the ones that enable flexibility in people's lives, that strengthen people's social connections and include a key person to care about the person into the future rather than caring for, rather than locking somebody in to a residential situation for the rest of their lives. But we also know from the literature over a number of years that there's a continued pattern of omission of older people with intellectual disabilities in planning. People just aren't involved in plans for themselves. They do have ideas when they are asked, and they do look forward to leaving home. We also know that when parents do plan, with or without the person with intellectual disability, there's difficulty in following those plans through, that it's a very slow, complex process, which is often halted by poor access to housing and support, which means that people can't leave home, even though they may well be ready to. And there's a recent study in Australia that shows very clearly the reliance on the social and financial capital of families to enable people to move out of home in middle age or later life. And we still have a very high proportion of adults who remain at home with their families well into middle age. Over the time which I've been doing my research, it's very clear now that the voices of people with intellectual disabilities figure much more strongly in the research and in service systems. There's a sense that people do know what they want in later life. They want to continue to do the things they've been doing when they were younger. They want to have control over their lives. They want to exercise choice. They want to have friends. They want to remain active and engaged. And many have positive expectations. There's a recent piece of work by somebody in Sweden who says that people with intellectual disabilities anticipate being more like other older people as they age, because those differences of having a job or not having a job will begin to disappear. But at the same time, there's a great fear of retirement. There's nothing to replace engagement and social connections when people retire from day programs or for supported employment. People fear this, and they do so with some justification. The social relationships and social participation and community connections of people as they get older are quite similar to those across the rest of their life course. People are present, but they're not participating in civic society and community groups. They're living in a distinct social space made up of their friends with intellectual disabilities, family and staff. Basically, many people have no friends without intellectual disabilities. They have small, dense social networks. And as they age, those networks are subject to disruption and are endangered by moving accommodation or moving out of day programs. And people's social networks shrink and their participation declines. Community groups in general suggest that they're willing to include people with intellectual disabilities, but they really don't know how to do that. There's been, over the last 25 years, a range of research around access and linkage programs to support people to be included in mainstream community groups. We've been doing some recent work which is trying to redefine the binary of being present in the community or participating and seeing that as the need to have relationships. We've begun to look at fleeting or convivial encounters, where people have much shorter fleeting encounters with other people with a shared purpose or where they identify with others. So being known at your local coffee shop, sharing a class in a neighbourhood centre or in a library, sharing a purpose, being known as an individual is often very important if you don't have a lot of social connections. Or on the other hand, being an active participant in community groups where there's equal membership and it's mutually rewarding for all members and working towards a common goal. We need to think more broadly about what we mean by participation. It's not just having long-lasting friendships. We've recently completed 2 studies which are around the transition to retirement and supporting people to be included in community groups. And those, I'm going to talk about those much more in the workshop later on. But what's become clear is that there are some known conditions that we need to have in place in order to support people to be part of ordinary community groups as they age. People need to be able to attend groups on a regular basis. There needs to be shared activities that enable people to come together, to share in a common purpose, which will enable those social interactions to happen. There needs to be support from the authority people in community groups, from the leaders. And there needs to be a sense that people have a right to be there, an expectation this is a good place to be. We know a lot more too now about the multiple dimensions of enabling support, the way in which we can use things like active support, co-worker support, and what we've called active mentoring to support people to be included. So we've demonstrated that people can participate effectively in community groups and build social connections in groups. But what's been also clear is that even though you might participate in a community group, that participation doesn't necessarily lead to friendships outside of groups. You may become known in your community, but that doesn't mean you have close friends with other people in the community. So from looking back over the data and the research that's happened over the last 25 years, it seems really clear to me that there's a continuity of data and a continuity of patterns. I would have expected to see differences, and we all said it's going to be different for the next generation of people as they age, because they'll have lived through different historic time. But what's evident is there's very little change in the social inclusion of people who were born in the 1930s, who were 60 in the first studies in the 1990s. Their lives now look quite similar to the people who were born in the 1950s, who are 60 now. They look different in terms of clothing and the social context, but actually they're as socially excluded as the first cohort of older people. So why have we made so little progress? I think part of the problem is that we've failed to lay good foundations for ageing. People's individual biographies haven't changed. Neither the generation that was old 30 years ago nor the generation that's old today were socially included in their younger years. They haven't lived healthy lives. They haven't received good health care. And the next generation, people that are middle-aged now, fare similarly poorly on dimensions of friendship, wider social networks and active participation in community groups and access to quality health care. So I suspect that the next generation of people who are older, the ones in 20 years' time, are going to have very similar characteristics to the people now and the people 30 years ago. We haven't paid sufficient attention at the individual level to building people's social connections. Social connections are invisible. Then if you don't build connections, it's not high risk for services. Nobody notices that services aren't doing it. And what we've moved to very much is a model of individualised funding, which has tended, certainly in Australia, to translate into individual companionship models, where you pay one support worker to go out with one person, basically to be their companion, to keep them company, rather than to build their social networks. And there's a whole range of pervasive generative factors that lead to social inclusion. There's a sense still that we differentiate people, that people with intellectual disabilities are at the bottom of the social hierarchy, and that we have very negative expectations of them. We don't expect them to participate. We still have very negative stereotypes and the absence of meaningful contact between people with and without intellectual disabilities. We've neglected any collective action to try and tackle entrenched expectations and exclusionary structures. The historic time in which my generation has aged in has become one that's focused on individualism. We're worried about individuals, how they can take their own responsibility for their own lives, how they can be good consumers, rather than worrying about how they can be included in the collective society. And this is beginning to be seen much more strongly in Australia, where we have a new Australian National Disability Insurance Scheme, where we're paying attention to individual rights. We're paying attention to giving people reasonable and necessary disability supports and spending a lot of energy trying to untangle disability supports from health supports or education supports or housing supports. And we're paying very little attention to underpinning and making things accessible and responsive, making mainstream health systems more accessible and responsive, mainstream housing systems and the community and so on. And it's no news to people, I think, and it's very clear from the special edition of Bild, that people with intellectual disabilities are invisible in mainstream ageing research and in mainstream service systems. And in many ways it's not surprising, because they only make up something like 0.4% of the population of older people. Even though their numbers are growing, they're still a very small proportion. So their group-specific issues haven't been included in mainstream ageing policies and systems. And they fit very poorly into overarching directions about successful ageing and active ageing. And they're certainly not on the radar of gerontological researchers. And just to finish off, it's clear from a review of the literature over the last 25 years that there really is an absence of strong evidence about how to support people who are ageing with intellectual disabilities. We know a lot about the problems that they experience, but what we've had is many, many small-scale studies, descriptive, one-off studies, that haven't built necessarily on the knowledge that's already there. When you look across both in Australia and in the UK and in the US, there's very few systematic programs that have been building knowledge about ageing. We still have some very unhelpful assumptions that are built into some of our research. We tend to use 40 years as the defining factor, which isn't old. People aren't old when they're 40, and yet we still find research studies that use 40 as the cut-off and say if you're old when you're 40. We have very little attention to things like middle age in intellectual disabilities. We tend to say, everybody over 40 is old. We haven't explored what middle age means. Research has often not been fit for purpose. We need to move on from having small-scale exploratory studies to studies that can begin to test theories, that can begin to design interventions and test the efficacy of those interventions. So I guess to finish off, my proposition is that we're failing older people because we're failing younger people and middle-aged adults with intellectual disability. We need to make sure that older people have good foundations for ageing, and we're only going to do that if we pay attention to the social inclusion and the good health support of people who are younger and middle-aged. Thank you very much.